December 6, 1944, Boundary Bay, British Columbia, 4:17 a.m. The sentry heard it first, a low rumble, engines spooling up in the dark. He turned toward the flight line, squinting through the coastal mist that rolled off Georgia Strait like cold breath. The silhouette of a B-24 Liberator materialized from the gloom, its 4 Pratt & Whitney engines whining to life without authorization, without a flight plan, without a crew. No one had signed out the aircraft. The tower hadn't cleared anyone for takeoff. Inside that massive bomber, alone in the cockpit designed for 2 pilots and a crew of 8, sat Sergeant Donald Palmer Scratch, 25 years old, Saskatchewan farm boy, son of a country doctor who pulled teeth for chickens during the Depression. A pilot once described as having excellent potential and gentlemanly demeanor. He was drunk, and he was about to destroy millions of dollars of military equipment, terrorize 3 airfields across 2 countries, make fools of fighter pilots sent to stop him, and somehow, impossibly, be remembered not as a criminal, but as one of the most gifted natural pilots the Royal Canadian Air Force had ever seen. This wasn't even his first time. The Liberator began to roll. Maymont, Saskatchewan, 1919. A dirt street farming village where the wind never stopped and hope came measured in inches of rainfall. Donald Palmer Whitman Scratch entered a world still reeling from the Great War, born into the home of Dr. John Archibald Scratch, a physician who would later tell Pierre Burton for his book on the Great Depression, "I pull their teeth and lance their boils and deliver their babies. They pay what they can. A chicken here, a ham there." The marriage didn't last. By age 3, Donald was living with his mother in Ashmont, Alberta, an even smaller community northeast of Edmonton. A broken home, the psychiatrists would later note, though young Donald himself seemed unbothered by the divorce. He had 2 older brothers, both doctors, both serving overseas as medical officers when war came again. Donald worked as an apprentice pharmacist in Edmonton, affiliated with the University of Alberta. A good job, respectable, safe. But in the summer of 1940, with the Battle of Britain raging across the Atlantic and stories of fighter pilots like Willie McKnight, a fellow University of Alberta student, filling the newspapers, safety wasn't what Donald Scratch wanted. He wanted to fly. He wanted to fight. June 17th, 1940. The RCAF recruitment office in Edmonton. The interviewer studied the young man across the desk, 21 years old, earnest, well-spoken. He wrote in his assessment, "Excellent type, gentlemanly, courteous, should make good as pilot, strongly recommended for commission as pilot. Service number R6Jo973. The Canadian military machine swallowed him whole, sending him east by train to No. 1 Manning Depot in Toronto, then to initial training school. He impressed his instructors. They saw something in him, a natural aptitude, a hunger to prove himself. They sent him north to No. 2 Elementary Flying Training School near Fort William at Lake Superior's western end, where he would learn to fly on de Havilland Tiger Moths. 65 hours of dual and solo time. His instructors wrote glowing reports, appears quite conscientious and sensitive. His flying ability is of a high average. He is very keen and has the right attitude for service life. Should develop into a very good pilot. Another instructor added by hand, "This airman's progress has been very favorable. He is exceptionally keen and willing. Because of his keenness and tenacity, he should develop into a high-average pilot, best suited for twin-engine aircraft." Twin-engine aircraft, not fighters. But Scratch didn't know that yet. He moved to Camp Borden for advanced training on Harvard's and Yale's, 88 combined hours. By late April 1941, he graduated and received his promotion to sergeant. Assignment? No. 118 Squadron, fighter, at RCAF Station Rockcliffe in Ottawa. A fighter squadron, his dream. It lasted 42 days. Wing Commander Ernest Archibald McNabb was a Battle of Britain veteran. He knew what fighter pilots looked like, how they moved, how they thought. He looked at Sergeant Donald Scratch and saw something else. A sound pilot, but not considered fighter pilot material. 6 words that changed everything. One day after being released from 118 Squadron, Scratch found himself on a train to Halifax, then to 119, Bomber Reconnaissance, Squadron in Yarmouth, flying Bristol Bolingbrokes on anti-submarine patrols over the cold Atlantic, twin-engine bombers hunting U-boats in the grey nothing of the Bay of Fundy. Not the glamour of fighters, not the combat he'd imagined. After 6 months, his commanders rendered their verdict: below average, erratic, on twin-engine aircraft. Believe this pilot's heart is not in bomber reconnaissance work, but they kept him on squadron anyway. And on December 1st, 1941, they promoted him to flight sergeant. The Canadian military was expanding rapidly, and they needed pilots, even ones whose hearts weren't fully in it. In January 1942, 119 Squadron moved to Sydney on Cape Breton Island. Scratch went with them. 2 months later, his world shattered. March 16, 1942. Dawn patrol briefing at Sydney. Anti-submarine operations over the Atlantic. Just below freezing, overcast ceiling at 6,400 feet, 8 miles visibility. Flight Sergeant Donald Scratch and his crew climbed into Bristol Bolingbroke 9064 at 6:55 a.m. The crew, Sergeant D.G. Dixon on the guns, Sergeant F.A. Connolly on the wireless, Sergeant Robert L. Parker, navigator, by some accounts a close friend. 1/3 of the way down the runway, the starboard Bristol Mercury engine missed. Scratch continued the takeoff. The aircraft became airborne, climbing southeast to about 300 feet, then initiated a climbing turn to starboard. The starboard Mercury sputtered once more and died completely. Airspeed bled away. Altitude collapsed. The Bolingbroke flew over railway tracks, struck a high-tension power line, skimmed along treetops, stalled, and crashed with the right wing low. Category A damage, total write-off. Sergeant Parker was killed. Dixon and Connolly suffered minor injuries. Donald Scratch suffered bilateral fractures of both ankles and second-degree petrol burns. He was hospitalized for 6 months. The pain was constant, throbbing, inescapable. But worse than the physical agony were the nightmares. A later psychiatric assessment documented what happened in those dark hospital nights. He had repeated nightmares of horrible flying situations in which things got out of control, and just as he was about to have a serious accident, he would awaken. He was usually trembling during the time with perspiration, tense with fright. He was able to go back to sleep after a while. The situation continued for about a year. What we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. What the RCAF in 1942 called weakness. The investigating board determined the crash was caused by faulty spark plugs in the starboard engine. They recommended inspecting and cleaning plugs every 40 hours on all aircraft with Mercury 15 engines. The recommendation would save lives. It was too late for Parker, too late for Scratch. During his recovery, the RCAF promoted him to Warrant Officer 2nd Class. Excellent type of airman, fully qualified and worthy of promotion. In September 1942, a doctor cleared him to resume flying duties, though he should be fitted with special supports for his ankles. 2 years later, Scratch would sign an affidavit describing his permanent injuries. "I have been bothered almost continuously with my ankles and feet since they were injured. I am unable to run and have difficulty descending stairs. This is due to the stiffness that is apparent in both, but more marked in the right ankle. All of my movements are hindered by my feet, which give me pain and discomfort, except when sitting or lying down. Weather also bothers them, and cold and dampness likewise causes them to ache." But in March 1943 he was commissioned as a pilot officer. New service number J26G69. By May he was back on flying duties, sent to Montjoly, Quebec, then to Gander, Newfoundland, for training on the consolidated B-24 Liberator. The Liberator was a beast. 4 engines, massive wingspan, complex systems. It required strength to fly, arm strength for the yoke, leg strength for the heavy rudder pedals. On 15-hour patrols far out over the Atlantic, or in emergencies with an engine shut down, that strength became critical. Scratch's shattered ankles would never be strong enough, and everyone knew it. October 16, 1943, Number 10, Bombing and Reconnaissance, Squadron, Gander, Newfoundland, the North Atlantic Squadron, a highly successful unit that would attack 22 U-boats and sink 3 before war's end. Flying Officer Donald Scratch reported for duty. The B-24 Liberator required 2 pilots, a captain in the left seat commanding the aircraft and crew, and a co-pilot in the right seat assisting with the complex systems and sharing the exhausting work of long overwater patrols. Rookie pilots started in the right seat. With experience, proven performance, and squadron attrition, they moved left. Everyone moved left eventually, except Scratch. His first flight on squadron, local circuits with his commanding officer, Wing Commander M.P. Martin, then a short cross-country to Torbay. Familiarization flights. He flew only 14 flights in his first month and a half, primarily local circuits. Something was wrong. The squadron operations record books tell the story in negative space. What isn't there? While other pilots flew multiple operational sorties, Scratch's name appeared sporadically. While other pilots advanced to captain positions, Scratch remained in the right seat. In December, he was sent to Alberta for a chemical warfare course at Experimental Station Suffield. His assessment, a very capable pilot, was interested in the material covered and the course, could have made better grades had he applied himself more diligently. He placed 4th out of 6. Back to Gander, back to the right seat. Through the first 6 months of 1944, Scratch flew as second pilot to a series of aircraft captains. Flight Lieutenant J. Sanderson, Flight Lieutenant J. P. Dale, Flying Officer A. P. Chester. Then, on June 3rd, he was paired with Flying Officer R. F. Bedford. Bedford had arrived on squadron after Scratch. Bedford flew as a co-pilot for 5 months before earning his captain's position. When Bedford moved to the left seat, Scratch, with more time on squadron, was assigned to fly in the right seat under him, a peer, a junior peer, now his captain. Later, psychological assessments found that Scratch worried about it a great deal, and there was considerable evidence that his future as a pilot occupied much of his thought. His commanders believed his ankle injuries prevented him from handling emergencies, especially single-engine operations that required sustained heavy pressure on the rudder pedals. They were probably right, but being right didn't make it easier. Donald Scratch had joined the RCF 4 years earlier with dreams of becoming a fighter pilot, of proving himself in combat, of advancement and honor. Instead, he'd been rejected from fighters, survived a crash that killed his friend, suffered permanent injuries, and now watched younger pilots move past him into the positions he'd never hold. He was trapped. And on a rainy Monday night in June 1944, something inside him snapped. June 19th, 1944. The weather at Gander was terrible. Winds gusted to 50 miles per hour. Rain lashed the station. Ice at altitude. The temperature hovered near freezing. No safe flying was possible. No. 10 squadrons stood down for the day. The officers' mess was busy, smoky, loud. After dinner, Flying Officer Scratch approached Wing Commander Martin with a drink in his hand. He asked how long it would be before he would be considered for a captain's position. Martin told him his future depended entirely on himself. Scratch replied that he was going to work as hard as possible to qualify himself for such an appointment. Some stories, possibly apocryphal, say there was also a lively discussion over many drinks about whether a Liberator could be started, taxied, flown and landed by one man alone. The general consensus: it was far too complex. Whether that argument happened or not, at 3:45 the following morning, Flying Officer Donald Scratch left his quarters and made his way to the flight line. He was likely still drunk. He selected 10 Squadron Liberator Y, a bare metal former RAF Liberator GRV with RCF serial 596. He walked around the aircraft, removing the wheel chocks. He opened the crew door inside the bomb bay, climbed inside, made his way up to the cockpit, and strapped himself into the left seat, the captain's seat. In the dark, without any help, he primed and started all 4 engines. At Gander, aircraft launched long-range patrols at all hours, and ground crews constantly tested engines throughout the night. One Liberator starting up at 3:45 a.m. and taxiing wasn't unusual. He unlocked the brakes and pushed the throttles forward. At 3:45 a.m., the flying control officer in the tower received a radio call from Y for Yoke requesting a radio check. The FCO sent a few check calls and waited for a reply. Then he heard the Liberator's engines powering up. He grabbed binoculars and spotted Scratch on the runway. Scratch actually radioed for permission to line up for takeoff. The FCO directed him to the runway in use, then contacted operations to ask if this was a scheduled patrol. Operations had no knowledge of any scheduled aircraft. The FCO radioed the pilot. Was this a local flight? Affirmative. Scratch asked for clearance to move to takeoff position. Cleared. He taxied into position and was instructed to line up between the flares into the wind. He was given permission to take off. Scratch began his takeoff roll, then cut the throttles after a short distance. Any problems? No. He asked permission to turn around and return to takeoff position. Granted. But when the FCO asked him to hold there, Scratch didn't respond. The FCO called 3 times without reply, then asked Scratch to flash his landing lights if he was receiving. The lights flashed. The FCO left his desk to call the hangar. Was anyone scheduled for a local flight? Checking the logbooks revealed that Liberator Y hadn't been signed out since the day before. The FCO hung up and was returning to his desk when he noticed Liberator Y was rolling, taking off. He grabbed the signal light and held a steady red beam, the signal to stop, on the accelerating bomber until it lifted into the darkness. Time, 4:00 a.m. Then, 4 hours of madness. The 10 Squadron Daily Diary for June 20th recorded what happened next. At approximately 04:30 hours local time, a weird and wonderful exhibition of low flying and shooting up the barracks was put on by FODP Scratch. He took off single-handed in Liberator Y and was airborne for approximately 4 hours. Scratch climbed into a dim sky that gradually lightened as dawn approached. Sunrise at 5:03 a.m. He had to know that even if he landed immediately, the outcome would be the same: court-martial and dismissal from the RCF. So he didn't land. For the next 4 hours, Scratch not only single-handedly flew the Liberator that supposedly couldn't be flown by one man, he flew it aggressively at extremely low levels for hours. He navigated 200 kilometers south to United States Naval Air Station Argentia on the west coast of the Avalon Peninsula. There he repeatedly beat up the American airfield with low-altitude passes. Far-fetched claims would later surface about American P-40 fighters scrambling to intercept him, with reports of Scratch rotating the top turret while the bomber flew on autopilot. But Argentia was a Navy airfield. The US Navy didn't have P-40s. And 129 squadrons Hurricane Tuotins, the only fighters stationed in Newfoundland, didn't scramble until 8:55 a.m. By then, Scratch was already back at Gander. He flew back and forth over Gander at extremely low levels. Back and forth, back and forth. Finally, the station commander in the tower raised him on the radio and ordered him to land immediately. "Yes, I will do it." He brought the Liberator in for landing and rolled to a stop. Service police were waiting, along with Wing Commander Martin and the station commander. Martin followed Scratch up the runway in a car, got out, walked around to the front of the aircraft, and signaled Scratch to roll up the bomb doors. Scratch complied. Martin climbed through the crew hatch and found Scratch in the left seat, trying to restart the auxiliary power unit, which had quit for lack of fuel. Martin ordered him to the right seat. Scratch was reluctant. He wanted to finish the flight himself by taxiing back to the parking stand. Eventually he complied. During the taxi back, Martin asked why he'd done this. Scratch's reply: he was getting tired and had been here too long. He was under close arrest by 9:40 a.m. that same morning, confined to a detention cell. Despite the drama, 10 Squadron continued operations without missing a beat, launching 7 training and convoy escort sorties that day. 2 days later, Liberator Y was flying again, none the worse for wear. For the next 2.5 months, Scratch remained under arrest. He could not leave his assigned quarters, receive visitors, or have any communications except personal mail. Denied mess privileges, he took meals alone in his room. Any exercise required medical officer approval and a provost escort. If allowed outside, he could not enter buildings or speak to anyone. On June 14th, he was informed his court-martial was 4 days away. 3 charges. 1. Flying Liberator, Y without authorization. 2. Taking off after being refused permission by the tower. 3. Flying at low levels without authorization. July 18th, 1944, 4 years to the day since Scratch enlisted in the RCF, a general court-martial was convened at Gander. He would be convicted on all counts. In his defense, Scratch told investigators his actions were brought about by his isolation and inactivity and his strong desire to do something active. Beyond his injuries and possible PTSD, 2 other family issues had begun to impact his perspective. His 58-year-old father was dying of cancer, and his mother's health had declined seriously after learning of his Bolingbroke crash. According to psychiatric assessment, she had taken to bed with cardiac complaints which were apparently precipitated by the patient's accident. A psychiatric consultant interviewed Scratch once. His report stated, "During the interview, the patient was calm, spoke well, somewhat reticent, but gradually told his story. He does not appear concerned or anxious. There is no evidence of depression or psychotic behavior and thinking." In the diagnosis space, the consultant wrote, "No psychiatric illness at present, although I'm certain that for a year following his crash, the patient suffered psychoneurosis, anxiety state." At the bottom of the report, above the consultant's signature, was a sentence followed by a line to fill in. "Is this man fit for duty?" The consultant wrote, "He is at present fit for all duties." On September 2nd, 1944, former flying officer Donald Scratch was dismissed from His Majesty's Royal Canadian Air Force. He left Newfoundland, likely in civilian clothes, and boarded a train for the long journey back to Canada. Here's where the story becomes extraordinary. No more than 12 days after his dismissal in Newfoundland, Donald Scratch was applying for re-enlistment at No. 3 Training Command Recruiting Unit in Montreal. A memorandum dated September 18th on RCF Special Reserve letterhead, signed on behalf of the Chief of Air Staff, shows he was being allowed back into the Air Force. He had been examined and is qualified as an airman pilot, AC2 Standard Group. The memo continued, "In the event of enlistment, applicant is to be remustered to Special Group, effective date of enlistment, and appointed to the rank of temporary sergeant, paid, effective day of enlistment." Read that again. Court-martialed and dismissed on September 2nd, re-enlisted as a sergeant on September 23rd, 19 days. The RCAF was desperate for pilots. The war in the Pacific was escalating. Crews were being trained on Liberators for service against Japan, and Donald Scratch, for all his troubles, was an exceptionally gifted pilot. By Thursday, September 21st, he had re-enlisted in Montreal, was given back his original RCAF service number, R60973, and was now a sergeant again. He listed his address as Bell's Lodge, a rooming house at 1201 Dorchester Street. The next day he reported to the same Manning Depot in Toronto, where his career had started 4 years earlier. Days later, he was on a train to the West Coast and No. 5 Operational Training Unit at RCF Station Boundary Bay. Boundary Bay Airfield sat on the shores of Georgia Strait, beautiful flying country, nothing like isolated, weather-locked Gander. No. 5 OTU was training pilots to fly the B-24 Liberator, the same aircraft Scratch had stolen from Gander. Most student pilots arrived straight from service flying training school with experience on tail-dragging aircraft like the Avro Anson, Cessna Crane, or Airspeed Oxford. The Liberator had nose-wheel steering, requiring adjustment. No. 5 OTU had B-25 Mitchell bombers for transition training. twin-engine medium bombers used to familiarize student pilots with nose-wheel operations before moving to the intimidating four-engine B-24. Scratch found himself back in the right seat, despite his operational experience, despite having successfully flown a Liberator solo for 4 hours, despite proving definitively that he had the skill. The psychiatric consultant had declared him fit for full duties, but one wonders if, in the weeks since he left 10th Squadron, he had resolved the anxiety and PTSD-like issues that led to his Liberator escapade. He had not. The door had been slammed shut, then opened again, but the demons had walked through with him. December 6, 1944, pre-dawn darkness at Boundary Bay. Sergeant Donald Scratch, 3 months back in uniform, walked to the flight line, not toward a B-25 Mitchell, the medium bomber used for transition training, not toward his assigned aircraft, toward a B-24 Liberator. What happened in the next moments remains partially obscured by conflicting accounts, but the essential facts are clear. Scratch climbed into the Liberator and, in an action that defied all military protocol and sanity, either deliberately destroyed it on the runway or crashed it catastrophically during an unauthorized takeoff attempt. The bomber was obliterated, the runway was blocked, but Scratch wasn't in the wreckage. He had already moved to his real target, a B-25 Mitchell bomber, twin engines, sleeker and more agile than the lumbering Liberator. While maintenance personnel and officers ran toward the destroyed B-24, while chaos erupted on the flight line, Donald Scratch climbed into the Mitchell, started both engines, and took off. Time, approximately 4:30 a.m. He was drunk. He had just bombed his own airfield. And now he was airborne again. For the next 5 hours and 15 minutes, Sergeant Donald Scratch put on a flying display that witnesses would describe with words like impossible, brilliant, and terrifying. Scores of service personnel and civilians narrowly missed death as the big ship screamed down time after time, threatening to smash into the ground where they stood, Canadian press reported, twisting, rolling, diving without leveling off during the entire flight. He terrorized airfields at Seattle, Vancouver, and Boundary Bay. Zero-altitude aerobatic flying in a twin-engine bomber. Loops, rolls, violent maneuvers that should have torn the wings off. At Boundary Bay, the RCF scrambled 4 Hurricane fighters from Sea Island. Their primary orders: force the Mitchell out over the sea and shoot it down. Secondary orders: shoot Scratch down if he tried to return to Vancouver or Seattle. The fighters tried to box him in. Scratch made fools of them. He kept low to restrict their maneuvers, one witness later recounted. He teased them for 3 hours. His superior flying skills enabled him to easily elude them. Scratch put that B-25 through aerobatics that most of us thought only a tiger moth or a Harvard could do. Jerry Vernon, later an Air Vice Marshal of Canada, was on the same course as Scratch at Boundary Bay and had dinner with him the night before. He would later explain, Scratch had injured his leg in a previous Bolingbroke accident, and the powers that be felt he did not have enough strength in the leg to control the rudders on a Liberator if he lost an engine. For that reason, both at Gander and at Boundary Bay, they would not give him a captain's qualification, which is what pissed him off. For 5 hours, Donald Scratch demonstrated exactly what he could do. For 5 hours he proved his skill. For 5 hours he showed them all. The sun rose over Georgia Strait. Morning light painted the coastal islands gold. Scratch had been flying for over 5 hours. The Mitchell's fuel gauges were dropping. The Hurricane fighters still circled, maintaining their distance, waiting for orders. Tiring of the game of cat and mouse, one account states, Scratch flew over the wrecked Liberator at Boundary Bay. Then he turned toward Tilbury Island, 4 miles north of the aerodrome. What happened next remains disputed. Did he deliberately dive the bomber into the island? Did he lose control? Did the engines fail from fuel starvation? The Court of Inquiry would conclude there was insufficient evidence to determine whether Scratch was insane or if he deliberately crashed the bomber. They suggested a loss of control or fuel failure could have ended the flight, but everyone who watched said the same thing. He dipped the nose. He dove. Mitchell Bomber HD 343 struck Tilbury Island and disintegrated. Sergeant Donald Palmer Scratch, aged 25, was killed instantly. No one else was hurt. A neuropsychiatric consultant reviewed Scratch's case after his death, pointing to Scratch's apparent recognition that his environment was working its mild poison into the mind and planting the seeds of contempt and unrest. The consultant stopped short of making a diagnosis, but proposed a theory. I feel that all one can say reasonably without further information is that this was a case of alcoholism superimposed upon an emotionally unstable, inadequate, immature personality, and definitely lacking in judgment. It was the assessment of a different time, a time before we understood PTSD, before we recognized the invisible wounds of watching a friend die in a crash you survived, before we acknowledged that physical pain and professional rejection could compound into something devastating, before we admitted that broken people sometimes stay broken, even when we declare them fit for duty. Why did the RCAF allow him back? Why, after court-martialing and dismissing him for stealing a bomber, did they re-enlist him 19 days later and restore his rank? The answer lies in the context of late 1944. The war against Germany was approaching its final phase, but the Pacific War was intensifying. Canada was training crews for operations against Japan. They needed pilots. They needed experienced pilots. Donald Scratch was undeniably experienced. His commanders at Gander had watched him fly a Liberator solo for 4 hours, performing maneuvers that demonstrated exceptional skill. Yes, he had stolen the aircraft. Yes, he had violated every regulation. Yes, he deserved court-martial. But the official assessments couldn't quite hide the admiration. A weird and wonderful exhibition. Very capable pilot. Even the psychiatric consultant declared him fit for all duties. The RCAF calculated that Scratch's skill outweighed his instability. They believed they could use his talent while controlling his behavior. They were wrong. The second question is darker. Why did no one see it coming? Scratch had stolen a bomber before. He had demonstrated dangerous, erratic behavior while drunk. He had documented PTSD symptoms. He had chronic pain. He had expressed deep dissatisfaction with his career. Every warning sign was there. But in 1944, the RCAF didn't have the framework to see those signs as predictive. They saw individual incidents, not a pattern. They saw a discipline problem, not a mental health crisis. Jerry Vernon, who dined with Scratch the night before his final flight, later said, "On the first occasion they were concerned that he was going to fly the aircraft down to New York City, but he thought better of it and returned to base." He later told classmates at Boundary Bay that had been his intention. New York City. A stolen Liberator flown from Gander to New York would have been an international incident, an act so bizarre that it might have triggered a different response, perhaps genuine psychiatric care instead of court-martial and dismissal. Scratch thought better of it. He turned around. He landed. Maybe that was his mistake. Maybe if he'd kept flying, forced the RCAF to confront the full scope of his crisis, he'd have received help instead of punishment. Maybe he'd have lived. In the decades since, Donald Scratch has become something of a legend in Canadian aviation circles, the pilot who stole bombers, the man who made fools of fighter pilots sent to intercept him, the aviator who put a B-25 through aerobatics that seemed impossible. Some view him as a romantic figure, a rebel against authority, a skilled pilot unfairly held back. Others see him as selfish and reckless, endangering lives for his own ego. Both views contain truth. Hugh Halliday, the respected Canadian aviation historian who presented Scratch's story to the Canadian Aviation Historical Society in 2008, grappled with this tension. Some felt that telling Scratch's story would be lionizing a criminal, a misfit and selfish person. Even in 1944, RCAF authorities couldn't help but admire Scratch's illegal flying displays in their written reports. The Vintage Wings article on Scratch notes, some people feel that while he may have destroyed government property, he did not hurt anyone, while others have said it was just luck that no one else was killed. Both are true. The article continues. In truth, the men who had to collect his remains, such as they were from the spot where he ended his life, were most certainly affected for life. That's the part that gets lost in the legend. The maintenance crews who watched a B-24 destroyed on their runway. The fighter pilots ordered to shoot down one of their own. The civilians who narrowly missed death, as Scratch screamed overhead. The men who collected pieces of Donald Scratch from Tilbury Island. His mother, already in declining health after learning of his first crash, receiving news of his death. His father, dying of cancer, learning his son was gone. December 6, 1944, returned to that pre-dawn darkness at Boundary Bay. Sergeant Donald Palmer Scratch walking to the flight line. What was he thinking? Did he plan to die, or did he simply plan to fly? The evidence suggests he knew what he was doing. Jerry Vernon reported that Scratch had told classmates at Boundary Bay that during his first incident at Gander, he had planned to fly to New York City. That suggests calculation, planning. But the neuropsychiatric consultant also noted Scratch's recognition that his environment was working its mild poison into the mind and planting the seeds of contempt and unrest. Maybe Scratch knew exactly what he was doing. Maybe he knew he was destroying himself along with the aircraft. Maybe that was the point. At 4:30 a.m. he destroyed a B-24 Liberator, the aircraft he'd proven he could fly solo, the aircraft the RCAF said he wasn't strong enough to captain. Then he climbed into a Mitchell and flew for 5 hours, demonstrating skill that left witnesses stunned. He evaded 4 Hurricane fighters. He performed aerobatics that seemed impossible for that aircraft. He proved, definitively and fatally, that he had the skill. Then he dove into Tilbury Island and ended it all.